on fear. I think it's really interesting in your book. You kind of speak about, I guess, humanity's need for religion, about the kind of reality that religion provides solace for evils faced and comfort for evils ahead. And essentially kind of it could be and often is fear that drives people to religion. You then go on to talk about kind of how courage can set us free. I think I'd like to hear more about this. I think the sort of phrase that you use in the book is something like the victory of accepting naturalism consists in exerting control over one's own mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, easier said than done, I gotta say. Yeah, a couple things so this comes up, I think, in the book, in connection with, I think, Bertrand Russell. And so Russell, just briefly, was a kind of, before there were new atheists, he was a new atheist before the so-called new atheists. So he not only does he think there's no God, but he seems to see religion as largely an evil force in the world, and so on. And yeah, I think he says that fear is the main thing that drives people to religion. Now, in the book, I mean, I think that is probably not true. I just think it's much more complicated than that. So, for example, in the book, I make the simple point that, look, a lot of people are simply raised into religion. So I think this Russellian thing is kind of a caricature. People, it's just this superstition that people are driven to out of terror of death. That is just it's not accurate. I think it's just way too simple. I think the fear can be one factor, and there's no question that religion can provide a kind of comfort and solace. I think if I were writing this part of the book, I probably would write it a bit differently, man. I still do think, there is something admirable about just sort of what I would see as just facing reality, which is we're all going to die, and that's going to be the end of it. And being able to just live with that is a kind of accomplishment. I think that it's funny. I think that it's to me, it seems like it's the kind of thing that at least one way of sort of living with it is just getting used to it over time. And I think that so William Craig, and I quote this in the book, he describes this experience that I think is not uncommon when he was a kid, and it sort of hit him for the first time that, like, he was really going to die, and I think this, which I think is an experience a lot of kids go through. It's one thing to know it abstractly, but then to sort of connect it to yourself, and there's not going to be me anymore. I just think at first it's terrifying, but if you just live with it for a long time, you just get used to it. You know what I mean? I think it's it's the kind of thing that just happens with just the way human psychology is. We get bad news and we're freaked out at first, and then after a while we have a tendency to adjust to it. This is just part of our innate ability to sort of survive. And I was struck by this. There's this book that I read after I wrote the Value and Virtue book, called Society Without God. It's by this sociologist, Phil Zuckerman, and he studies the sort of Scandinavian countries, which are extremely secular. And one striking thing that he found is that not only are a lot of the people in these countries not religious, they're totally uninterested in religion. And they don't even really get this idea of the fear of death, and I think it's because they're just so used to living with the idea that that's how it is, and there's nothing to be done about it, that it loses its terror, and it does not freak them out. And so I guess this is an idea that if I were writing the book now, I would put this in there, which is, I think in the book I was portraying it as sort of this great accomplishment if you can conquer your fear of death. I think now I'm more inclined to the view of, like, yeah, it's a kind of accomplishment, but actually the way to do it is not through some heroic philosophical, or act of self-control, but rather just to let time pass, and you'll just get used to the reality, or the idea that this is how it's going to go. Did that get at your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like David Hume, as he was coming to the end of his life, he knew he was going to die. There were quite a few people quite shocked at how at
Hmm.
peace he was about the fact that he was going to die. Like this atheist should be
Yeah,
screaming, panicking, worrying, but he wasn't. He was very, very, very peaceful.
yeah,
So yeah, it is interesting. Thinking, clarity, having that time to
yeah,
reconcile yourself. These are all really important features, right?
yeah, yeah. And I think Hume's an interesting example where how did he do it? It's just he just got used to it through his whole. I mean, he had thought that way his entire life. I think it would what would be much more terrifying is if you were a theist until the last second and you somehow lost your faith and all of a sudden you were faced with this new reality. That's sort of horrific, but it seems plausible that for Hume it was just like for most of his life he had gotten used to the idea that that's how it was going to be. That reminds me of just one other thing about this Society Without God book that was sort of striking, which is some of the people, or at least one person that Zuckerman was talking to was, it may have been a nurse or something who worked in a, like a hospice care situation or a hospital of some kind, of course, where people were dying and facing death. And that person was explaining that in like Sweden or Denmark, Norway, whatever. Of course, there are some, religious people, Christians, and that they were saying that it tended to be the Christians who were most terrified at the end of their lives, and they were terrified about going to hell, basically, had they, lived the right way and so on. Whereas the non-believers who, again, had just lived for a long time with the idea of like, I'm going to die and that'll be it, were much more calm and peaceful in the face of death, because they didn't have the sort of terror of what was going to happen in the afterlife. So I mean, I guess the point maybe is overall is the psychology of all of this is a lot more complicated than it's sometimes portrayed maybe on the theist side. That the religious perspective is always comforting, and the atheist perspective must be terrifying. And the Hume case is interesting. Yeah, people were amazed. How is he doing this? Well, it's only amazing because you're just sort of trapped in this particular way of looking at it. It's just a lot more complicated, maybe.
Mm, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I've got two boys, 6 and 8, so both very, very young. When I first started going through my sort of, I guess you call it a deconversion or whatever it is, I was absolutely terrified by the idea that they were going to pass away and I wouldn't be able to see them again. Like that would be the end of the relationship. And the
Yeah.
more I've reflected on it, obviously I have no desire for them to pass away before me. Like that's not something I'm asking for. But the more I've thought about it and reflected upon it, I also kind of wonder if people do lose those close to them, whether they are actually not able to fully mourn that loss because there's always the hope of what's to come. It kind of, those who hope in that thing kind of view it as, well, you must be living a nihilistic kind of like completely sort of devoid of joy life. Whereas actually, the more I think about it, the more people can actually begin to celebrate and recognize the life that they had the interaction with for what it was. And actually, that's quite a special thing, though many theists wouldn't understand that. I don't know. That's my 2 pence on the thought of fear and death and those sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, to me, the probably on both sides, there's just some caricaturing of what the psychology of the other side must be like. And human beings are complicated, and there are a lot of different attitudes and so on. But I think the way you describe that makes a lot of sense. There's you've probably seen the film Dead Poets Society and the Carpe Diem idea. I think it captures maybe a reasonable way of looking at things on the atheistic side, where this is it, um, and that makes on the non-theist view, this is it. The time we spend with our loved ones is the only time we're going to spend with them, and yeah, that does make it extremely precious. And it runs against, I think, the idea, which I mentioned this in the book, Craig presses, that without God and an afterlife, everything in this life is sort of meaningless and it doesn't really matter. And I think it seems to run in the opposite direction. If this is it, then like it really matters, right?
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.